Hi, I'm Carolyn Smeenk. I'm a designer and researcher from Canada, and I just graduated with my Bachelor of Industrial Design from Carleton University. But I'm also really interested in user experience, and specifically user experience research. And this generally stems from an overarching interest in people and how other people live, and how to improve the lives of others. Largely, this comes from my background in high school, through volunteering, working with organizations such as Plan Canada as an ambassador. And I was especially interested this year for my thesis project when our school encouraged us to focus on the UN Sustainable Development Goals for the year 2030. And reading into all of these goals, I became increasingly interested in health and wellness, and particularly the effects of health and wellness and equality, and how equality impacts people's access to healthcare, and particularly in Canada, how that access can have different outcomes for people. And some of you may be wondering why Canada has public health care, but a lot of people forget that a lot of parts of Canada also look like this, and this is a lot of people's homes. 6 million Canadians, or 1/5 of our population, actually lives in rural or remote areas, and 17% of that group takes over 2 hours to access a hospital. And that could be from a combination of roads, by car, by bus, by snowmobile. And it can be incredibly difficult to access really quick healthcare, especially if you have a condition that is time sensitive. And with my background, specifically in women's health, I started to consider the issues that would present for a woman who's pregnant, and specifically in maternal health care, and specifically for a condition called preeclampsia. And many of you will be wondering, well, what's preeclampsia? And many people will recognize it as toxemia. It's a condition that happens can happen after the 20th week of pregnancy for women, and it causes hypertension and high levels of protein in the urine. And this condition, if left untreated, can cause seizures, strokes, and death of either the mother or the child. And it's an incredibly scary, unpredictable condition. It is the third highest killer of women internationally, and is prevalent in women from all different racial, geographic, socioeconomic groups. Kim Kardashian had it. And it's a condition that is incredibly unpredictable and needs to be treated very quickly. So living 2 hours away from a hospital is a really precarious situation to be in. But how do we make the diagnosis of this more accessible? How can we bring this treatment to people? So I wanted to better look at this question as a researcher, specifically wanting to be focused on people. It was really important for me to get a better understanding of how people in this context would live. Unfortunately, because this was my undergraduate thesis, I had 8 months to conduct all my research, and applying for the ability to speak with women in this condition would take longer than the entirety of my project. So I had to get creative about how I researched the way that they would live. So I started to get digging, and I created a persona. It's an imaginary person who I started to form relevant information around using secondary research, various theses that I read of other incredible researchers, Karen Campbell, who did an excellent research paper on isolated women, young mothers in Canada. And I started to form all this information about her background, her medical history, her values, and started to form an idea of what her life would look like. And another amazing source that I started to look at was the Preeclampsia Foundation. And they have a number of amazing, courageous stories of women who would experience preeclampsia, written in their own words about their experiences, and being able to share those with other women who are experiencing the condition. And it was absolutely heartbreaking reading these stories, and especially because an incredibly disturbing trend of physicians who didn't acknowledge their innate understanding of their own body, and being able to understand that they knew that there was something wrong with them and not trusting their understanding of that. And this really inspired me to create a system for women to be able to have more objective means of measuring their health conditions and being able to look at those symptoms. So they would be able to communicate with physicians and other medical practitioners. So I wanted to get a better understanding of what I would be asking women to do by doing this objective testing in their own homes. And I've never been pregnant and don't know many people who have. So I formed this empathetic testing suit so I could spend the day to simulate some of the feelings of being 30 weeks pregnant based on the size, based on the weight. And I brought in a number of tools that you would use to do this testing. And I started to learn some really interesting things. Using a blood pressure monitor, if you've ever used one before, they have all these unnecessary buttons and numbers, and it's not communicated in a way that is clear to a human who's not from the medical background. I started to use pH strips, which are used to measure various conditions in urine. And based on this, you're trying to match a tiny square, and it's changing color, and match it to another tiny square, and make sure that those colors are the same. And that's how you indicate what your condition is, or if you're at higher risk. And I had anticipated it would be difficult to be able to match those two colors to each other, but also incredibly stressful. I knew that I wasn't unwell, but I became more and more frustrated and unsure and anxious about that testing. This is also a product called a nun's cap. And it's a product that's used for people who have lower mobility to be able to collect urine samples. And it's an amazing device, and it's incredibly helpful, especially if you are more awkwardly shaped at a moment or have lower mobility. And some trouble that I came about using it, though, was that it was a large, singularly molded piece of plastic. It was incredibly ugly. And also, it was difficult to bring with me. I didn't want to leave it out anywhere. It was also difficult to clean. And generally made the experience feel more medical and uncomfortable. And lastly, I documented all the symptoms I felt, going through different symptoms that you would typically be looking for in this condition. And I started to realize that through my writing, I became more and more anxious as the day progressed and began to feel dizzy and nauseous and unwell. And I knew that I was not unwell. And this isn't the same nearly as being pregnant. But I started to be able to really empathize and sympathize with what I was going to be asking women to do and how emotionally taxing and trying that would be. So through this experience of doing this empathetic testing, I was able to map and really examine them. So creating a timeline of all the experiences that I had, looking at different touch points, and being able to pull out opportunities for changes. And then starting to ideate and create a narrative around how would I want this to play out and look like for someone, specifically for Heather, and what I want her experience to be. But what did this change about my project? Before, there's a lot of clinical thinking about the details, how things would be manufactured, how communication would take place. But this really got me thinking about what the entire system would look like. This is the end product of my thesis. And I ended up including an app which would help women be able to document this over time and also emotionally support them through the process of doing this testing on a regular basis. It followed a linear progression through all the different steps of testing. And it also culminated in a number of products that were informed by this testing. A blood pressure monitor that was easier to put on and use and included less of an interface that was burdensome. A focus on technology to empower women and increase the trust by physicians in their outcomes of their testing. A nun's cap, which was smaller, more mobile, and allowed women to be able to pack it, store it, bring it with them to work or while traveling. And also focusing on a series of artifacts that would encourage and be emotionally and pragmatically supportive of this process. In summary, I started to really understand or just touch on the edges of what this condition might be like and what you may emotionally need during this process. And this project isn't nearly complete or perfect, but I think it helps to illustrate some of the ideas that I have around healthcare and design for healthcare in terms of being a more empathetic and kind way of designing. In my mind, empathy can really be a form of innovation. All this technology already exists. It's just applying it in a way that makes sense for people. Thank you.